Okay, I'm going to jump into it. So welcome. Thank you for being here for part 3 of the Growth Readiness Series. This one is Strategy That Moves. And if you've been to one of these sessions before, you know I'm not here to deliver a one-size-fits-all framework or tell you to just align better. I've spent many years working inside organizations, often in marketing and sales roles, trying to help the teams grow. And so my insights that I'll share with you today are rooted in having to overcome some of the same breakdowns over and over again, whether that's departments creating their own strategies instead of laddering up to one, companies who have strategies that just haven't been revisited in years, or worse, were just never clearly articulated, or companies that have rock solid strategies on paper, but they never make it past the slide deck. And so this presentation today is my attempt to address those nuances and to pull together a lot of what we've already talked about so far in this series: alignment, culture, capability, and apply it to the very real work of creating a strategy that is alive, adaptable, and actually used, not just in theory, but in daily decisions, in your team's priorities, in your team's rhythms, and the way you course correct when things inevitably shift. Because if we all understand one thing by now, it's that the pace of change does not seem to be slowing down. So we have to figure out a way to become more flexible while also keeping in step with one another. And that's no easy job for any strategy. And so part of this is part of the series for growth readiness, and not just growth for the sake of growth, sustainable, scalable, aligned growth. This is the type of growth that I'm talking about. It doesn't outpace your culture, it doesn't confuse your customers, and it doesn't exhaust your people. And these 4 pillars are what I've seen consistently in organizations that are growth ready. They are strategic clarity and decision velocity. That means all the teams know where they're headed and they can move. So decisions don't stall out in ambiguity or get revisited and revised 6 times. Productive tension. So this is where there is healthy debate and not turf wars. So people feel free to disagree, challenge, but they still stay aligned on direction. Customer-formed innovation. That means that growth is grounded in real feedback, not assumptions, not the loudest opinions, but actual customer needs and behaviors. And operational adaptability. So the organization doesn't break when things shift. It flexes, it absorbs, it adjusts, and it keeps moving forward. But just like a building, these pillars don't float in space. They are anchored by something deeper, and we covered this last month: culture and capability. Culture is the invisible system that determines how people behave when things get messy. It shapes how decisions get made, how conflict gets handled, and whether teams can trust each other enough to move quickly. And capability, on the other hand, is your actual capacity to deliver. So that's your people's skills, your systems, your structure, your energy. And so if culture is brittle, meaning that trust is low, or feedback is being filtered, or people are afraid to challenge each other, it becomes destructive. And if capability is thin, if teams are stretched, if there's no slack in the system and people feel unsupported or even feeling unclear on how to execute, then the best strategy will stay stuck on that whiteboard. So in other words, if the foundation can't carry it, the strategy won't move. You'll see this in confusion, misfires, burnout, and people quietly giving up on the plan before it's even halfway. And that's why I always argue that culture and capability are not soft topics. They are the bedrock that determine whether your strategy ever gets a chance to work. So today we're going to look at strategy through this lens, as something that needs to be carried and reinforced by your people and your systems. So let's start by redefining what strategy is, as not as a document, but as a decision-making engine. Because strategy is not just about setting the direction, it's also about shaping behavior. It's what allows people across your organization at every level to make aligned decisions without having to ask for permission every time. And when a strategy is actually working, it does these 4 things really well. It clarifies direction, it guides trade-offs, it aligns action, and it adapts with integrity. So let's unpack that. Clarifying direction is the big picture. It answers, where are we going? And that's not just next quarter, but what change are we here to create in the world or for our customers? Guiding trade-offs. So a lot of strategic tension doesn't actually come from a lack of ideas. It comes from competing priorities. And a good strategy will help people say, this is what matters most right now, and this is what we're willing to pause or say no to in service of that. Align action. So strategy should cascade from the top to the front lines, not just in theory, but in how those departments and people are setting their goals, prioritizing their work, and collaborating across functions. And adapt with integrity. Strategy has to be able to flex. That's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. That means adjusting priorities when the world changes without losing sight of that core purpose. Because the best strategies, they really can't be locked in. They're alive. They need to be constantly learning and evolving. So from here on out, we're going to treat strategy as a system. And that means getting a few key ingredients right that I've already mentioned here already. But these are 6 components I found consistently in strategies that not only sound good, but they get used. The first is a clear through line. So this is like that golden thread that connects your big picture vision to your day-to-day decisions. So everyone from executives to frontline teams should be able to trace how their work ladders up to the long-term direction. Without that, you'll end up with siloed plans that drift apart over time. You also need, and a great change management practice is to say, what is in this for me, but also why now? Strategy isn't just about where you're going. It has to explain why it matters. So creating urgency, context, energy. Why is this the moment for this move? If you don't explain that, it risks feeling arbitrary or like the same conversation you've had 3 years in a row. And every real strategy requires hard choices. So that's the defined trade-offs. What are we going to prioritize at the expense of everything else? And the goal here is not obviously to say yes to everything. It's actually to be honest about resource constraints and to be very intentional about what you're not doing. It also needs to take into consideration functional implications. So a good strategy will be specific about what it means for each part of the business, not just what's changing, but who's going to have to work differently. What will operations need to shift? What will sales need to start saying? If you don't name those ripple effects, they get missed or resisted. You also obviously need markers of success. So you need to know what good looks like. They don't have to be perfect KPIs, but you should be able to know somehow whether you're making progress. So whether that's milestones, signals, or indicators that you pick that say, this means we're on the right track or we're not. And then one of my favorite topics, a feedback mechanism. So whether it's monthly pulse checks, quarterly recalibrations, or real-time client input, feedback turns a static strategy into a living one. And these elements all work together. Without them, your strategy just becomes another announcement. With them, it becomes a tool people can trust to make decisions in real time, especially when things get hard. And now that we've looked at what belongs in a strategy, let's talk about what to leave out, because that's just as important. And here's what I see all the time. I'll see a strategy that sounds good and looks impressive, but it will die in execution. And usually it's because one of these 4 traps. And I myself have fallen into some of these traps from time to time, especially number 1, which is to have in a strategy every possible tactic. It's really tempting to, especially when you're like a consultant, the marketing consultant who knows all the bells and whistles that a company can, all the levers that a company can pull in service of their strategy. But you really have to realize that you cannot do everything at once. The strategies can't be like a greatest hits album of everyone's pet projects and wish lists, because when everything is a priority, nothing is. So a strategy that tries to cover all the bases will never build momentum. It's just going to exhaust your team, drain your focus, and give you no clarity of when trade-offs get hard. So my advice is always to say less, but make it really meaningful. Trap number 2 is vague aspirations. Be the best. This is like delight customers, deliver excellence. They all sound inspiring, but what do they actually tell your team to do differently? If your strategy, your specific company strategy, can be printed on a coffee mug or used by any company in any industry, it's not really a strategy, it's just a slogan. And people can't move when things are that vague. They need specificity, they need direction, and they need constraints. The third trap is fluffy values. And this is where culture and strategy tend to drift apart, because Companies will say collaborate, but reward competition, or say trust, but micromanage decisions. So when values show up in strategy, but not in practice, it creates cognitive dissonance, and eventually that leads to disengagement. So if your values don't show up in your decisions, in your recognition, and how you lead, your strategy is not going to stick, because people are always watching what gets reinforced more than they're watching or more than they're listening to what gets said. Trap number 4 is inflexible timelines. It is important to have a plan and parameters, but if your strategy is tied to rigid timelines that can't bend when the world changes, it becomes too fragile. And the goal isn't to react to everything, but you do have to be able to adapt with intention. So I like to think of timelines as scaffolding, not handcuffs. Build in moments to check, sense, and shift, and feel free to do that. And don't consider it a failure. Consider it strategic maturity. So the bottom line is, if your strategy is too packed, too vague, too performative, or too rigid, it might look polished, but it's not going to move with your company. And your teams are going to feel it long before your metrics will reflect it. So I want to bring us all together in a way that feels real, not just as a framework, but as a practical system that anyone in your organization can navigate. And I call this a strategy formula. I've just found that it's the simplest way to ground the strategy is by answering these 4 questions. If you can answer these consistently across your business, you have a strategy that probably can move. So first is, where are we going? This is your North Star. This is your long-term direction. It's not just what you do, it's the impact you're trying to create for your customers, your market, or the world. This is thinking 5 to 10 years out. What are we building toward and why does it matter? And then second, what are we focused on? This is usually your short-term execution level. Not a laundry list, just the handful of strategic levers that you're committed to moving. And then third, how we will behave. This is where values and guardrails come in. Your strategy might be smart, but if people are burning out or second guessing or working in silos, it won't gain the traction it needs to be successful. So this layer is going to define the behaviors you want to reinforce as you grow. And likely, if you have values in your company, you already have them defined. You just really need to show how the strategy is how they're going to be reflected in the strategy. And that is really helpful to tell people how they're going to show up, and especially how they're going to show up under pressure. And then fourth, how are you going to adjust? And this is your cadence and your feedback loop, because your strategy, again, can't be one and done. This layer is going to answer, how do we revisit, refresh, realign when things change? It's your built-in agility focus. It's your built-in agility system, and it helps you evolve without losing focus. When these 4 layers in place, where we're going, what we're focused on, how we'll behave, and how we'll adjust, strategy becomes something that people can actually work with. It becomes a living system. So I want to walk through each of these one at a time, and I'll use a real company example to bring it to life. And I hope that helps kind of demonstrate how this all works. So let's start with the top of the strategy formula, where we're going. I call it the North Star. I just like that name. It really is the long-term direction that keeps everyone moving together, even when the day-to-day gets messy. It's not a tagline. It's not a branding exercise. It's a statement that keeps people focused on what matters. What matters when they're making decisions, what matters when they're setting priorities, and what matters when they're just trying to figure out whether this project still makes sense. But most companies that I found overcomplicate this. They create a mission, a vision, a purpose, and maybe a tagline too, because they feel like they're supposed to. But then no one can remember what any of them say, let alone use them to make real decisions. So I want to break it down to get clear on what actually matters. These are kind of like the classic definitions. Mission is what we do. It's usually the core work or offering. Vision is where you're going, so the future you're working towards. And purpose is why you exist, so the reason you're here beyond profit. So in theory, each one of them has a different job, why we exist, what we do, where we're going. But in practice, I found that the layering creates redundancy and confusion, especially if they're really not distinct and they're not being actively used in decision-making. So I would say to you, what actually matters is you need one clear shared articulation of your long-term direction that anchors your organization in purpose, points to the impact you're aiming to have, guides your priorities and trade-offs, and still inspires people to care. So I call that your North Star. one strong statement with fewer words and more clarity. So for our fictional company, which is an e-commerce logistics provider, because a lot of the work I do is in supply chain, I landed on, we're here to make delivery effortless for every business, every order, every time. That's their North Star. It's directional, it's grounded in impact, and it's simple enough to use and people can remember. It tells who you serve, who you stand for, and how you want the experience to feel. So, do you need to call it a mission, a purpose, a vision, a North Star? I really don't care. Just make sure it's inspiring enough to rally people, clear enough to drive decisions, and rooted in the impact you're here to make. Because the goal isn't perfect language, it's just clarity that moves people. So from there, the next step is turning that overarching direction into action. So let's talk about how to focus your energy in the short term through annual objectives. Once we've named our North Star, the long-term direction, we zoom in. What are we focused on this year? These are your annual objectives, very familiar to most of you. They're usually clear and measurable and cross-functional. These translate your strategy into focus. And when they're well-crafted, they do three things. They help you choose where to invest attention, time, and resources. They give teams a clear filter for what to say yes to and what to defer. And they make progress visible even before the big goals are fully achieved. So this isn't about packing in every departmental to-do list. It's about declaring what are the few things that matter most this year so that people can align, act, and adjust. So let me show you what this might look like in practice. For our fictional company, which is all about making delivery effortless, these are the three strategic priorities I made up to choose to focus on. I think they're clear, I think they're measurable, and I think they're obviously cross-functional, but most importantly, they ladder directly up to that North Star. So one could be improve on-time delivery, why it matters. You know, if they promise effortless delivery, reliability is probably a non-negotiable. So this objective is about keeping that promise consistently. The KPIs are pretty self-explanatory and straightforward. I want to make it clear that this isn't just operations job. Tech needs smarter routing. Customer experience is going to need to solve problems faster and escalate less often. So we're not just saying be better, we're defining what better looks like and who's going to make that happen. If we want to reduce order errors by 40%, because every error creates friction for customers and for your team, and the fewer the mistakes, the smoother the experience, which is a goal. So again, the KPIs are pretty self-explanatory. And again, it's a team sport. So ops needs to put new scanning protocols in place. HR needs to support with training. Tech needs to flag potential errors before they become client issues. So it's not about fixing problems. It's about building the system that's going to prevent them. And then 3, improve client self-service and transparency. Because effortless isn't just fast, it's visible. I'm going to assume that customers want to know where things stand without having to ask. So this might be looking at fewer support tickets for where's my order, more portal usage, and ideally an improved NPS. And to get there, tech will need to build a platform. Marketing will need to ensure clients understand how to use it. Support will need to reduce the number of manual lookups and focus on higher value service. And this one's about empowerment. So giving customers more control without increasing your team's workload. These objectives do the hard thing. They require trade-offs. They're shared across departments and they're deeply tied to the experience you're trying to create. But strategy isn't just what you do, it's also how you show up while you're doing it. So next I want to talk about values, behaviors, and guardrails, because execution only works if your culture can carry it. And when you're chasing ambitious goals, especially cross-functional ones, the how will matter just as much as the what. So this slide introduces a key piece of strategy that I would argue most companies overlook, which is behavioral alignment. They may have overarching values at the top. They may have them on a poster in the warehouse, but it needs to be integrated into the strategy. These values and guardrails are not just to sound good on paper, they really should create shared filters for decision-making. Because when tension hits, and believe me, it will, your team is going to need more than a KPI. They need to know what is okay to compromise on and what's not. And if you've ever heard conflicting versions inside your company of what good looks like, that's your sign that this piece might be missing. So we're not talking about, vague wall art. We want practical decision-shaping behaviors that clarify what we reward, what we expect, what we're going to protect. And I have a couple examples that I've created for this fictional company. And actually, they already had values. And so I needed to figure out how to take their company values and how to fit them into this type of strategy. So these are 4 that I picked. One is deliver with precision. And the quote is, we sweat the small stuff so customers don't have to. This is about quality and execution, not about being perfect, but it's about being intentional. So we're saying accuracy, ownership, and preventing problems before they reach the customer. And the guardrail we're putting out there is that precision over perfectionism. If you're like me, you might need to hear that multiple times a day. If we chase 100% on every minor detail, we're going to block momentum. So the real test is going to be, is this good enough to meet the promise we made to the customer? And you want to give people these questions to ask themselves because it really helps them filter out noise. Build what's next. So we solve real problems with smart, scalable solutions. This encourages innovation, which is one of their top values. But it's not innovation for its own sake. It's also about relevance. So building things that solve pain points, not just like chasing the next shiny object. So the guardrail is innovation needs relevance. Don't build what the customers don't need. Ask yourself, will this make the experience faster or better for the customer or the team? And then win together. So this is about succeeding by making each other and our partners stronger. One of their overarching values was win-win partnerships. So here the focus is on collaboration with edge. So not passive agreement, but healthy challenge. Speaking up when it's uncomfortable, sharing wins and accountability. And the guardrail is collaboration over consensus. The goal is not groupthink, it's honest input. So before nodding along, ask, is your silence serving the team or am I withholding something they need to hear? Make it easy. We've reduced complexity and removed friction internally and externally. This one anchors the experience side of the brand. It's about usability, clarity, and respecting people's time, whether it's a client, a teammate, or a driver. So simplicity should serve strategy, but don't cut corners that cost trust. So this is clearly letting people know that we want to streamline, but not at the expense of quality, accuracy, or safety. So together, these 4 values act like a compass. They're not going to cover every situation, but they will help your team navigate those gray areas and make faster, better aligned choices in the moment, especially when you're scaling. So now that we've talked about how to behave, I want to talk about how we're going to revisit and adjust the strategy itself, because even the best roadmap will need recalibration. So we've named the direction, we've named the focus with the annual objectives, and we've named the behaviors. But even the best strategy will fall apart without rhythm. And I find this is another place where teams might get stuck, and not because they don't plan well, but because they don't set up the system to revisit, realign, and recalibrate. So to be clear, a one-time offsite is not a strategy system. A great Q1 plan is not going to carry you through Q4 unless it has space to evolve. And that is why I would argue you need a cadence and operating rhythm, a built-in structure for keeping the strategy alive after that meeting ends. And so here's, once again, a fictional cadence and operating rhythm that I designed for this company to support their living strategy, to keep their cross-functional teams aligned, and to create these predictable touch points for learning and recalibration. So on this slide, I just have kind of who is going to be in these meetings and what they are for. But there's also, I feel like, some pitfalls to avoid that I should mention too. So for annual planning, this is your foundation setting moment. Once a year, you probably already do this. You zoom out, you reaffirm your North Star, you align on your 3 to 5 strategic priorities, and you lock in your OKRs or your KPIs. But the key here is it's not just about vision. You also have to use customer and operational data, not just big ideas to shape your direction. And I would say to include 2 things that most teams skip. This is what we're not going to do list, and a 1-pager that explains what the plan means for each team. And one more tip, instead of like a 1-day offsite, block 2 or 3 half days to let people think, and let the insights simmer. And some pitfalls to avoid: don't have only executives in the room. Don't overcommit without checking your capacity. And don't treat your strategy like a wish list instead of a real commitment. Then you're going to want every 90 days, the quarterly strategic refresh. That's when your strategy just gets a gut check. That's where you revisit your priorities. Are they still right? What's working? What's shifted? What's no longer serving with us? You might start with what's changed since we set these goals and look at your lagging and leading indicators. This is where you should kill the zombie projects that are still walking around, but they're not adding value. Use a visual dashboard or a single slide. And then walk away with this meeting with at least one thing you're adjusting and why. Don't let this turn into a status meeting. Don't ignore the signs of fatigue that show up in this meeting. If people seem tired of talking about your strategy, that's a red flag. And don't fail to communicate any decisions that are made in this meeting clearly to the teams below you. Monthly syncs. This will be a pulse check. So they're not just for updates, they're for surfacing friction and reinforcing focus. So you might use the same 4-question format every time. What's working? What's unclear? What's changed? What are we adjusting? This is an hour max for team leads. They bring one slide, they track insights, nothing gets lost. Don't turn it into a task list meeting. Don't avoid friction, and don't let it blend into operational noise. It's really meant to make sure you're still aligned. Weekly execution rhythms or weekly huddles. This would be your ground level check. So are you focused on the right things this week? Reinforce priorities. This is to catch disconnects. This is to celebrate momentum. And you should ask in these meetings when things come up, what strategic priority is that connected to? And welcome when someone says, I'm not sure, because that's gold. That just means the strategy hasn't landed yet. It's a great opportunity. Keep it light. Keep it 15 to 30 minutes max. Pitfalls to avoid for this is don't assume that you understand something instead of confirming it. And don't fail to follow up on what gets surfaced in these meetings. And then strategic pauses. So finally, don't just move forward, build in moments to look back. So this could be after a major launch, at mid-year, or post-pivot. Pause and reflect, not to place blame, but to capture any learnings. What did you think was going to happen? What actually happened? What did you learn? What would you do differently? This is separate from performance reviews. And if the learning is useful, I would say share it organizationally. And then pitfalls to avoid: don't turn it into a blame session. Don't ignore the insights. And don't only do this when something fails. So with this rhythm in place, and you can see this affects all different levels. You're not going to be in a meeting every day, but your strategy won't just live in the leadership deck. It will live inside the business. But then again, to make this rhythm meaningful, you also need the right inputs and sensing mechanism. And that's what I want to cover next. So feedback and sensing mechanisms is not just what the dashboards say, but it's also what your people and customers are feeling, experiencing, and noticing. And these are the 4 big categories. KPI tracking, that's obvious. It's your outcome data. Leading indicators, so those are your behavioral or process signals that tell you whether the work is working. Employee listening loops and customer feedback mechanisms. I think the first 2 are pretty self-explanatory, so I'm not going to spend time rehashing how to capture metrics. But instead, I want to zoom in on the last 2, employee and customer listening, because if you can catch misalignment here before it becomes failure, this is where you're going to get the signals that you need. And one thing that comes to mind for me is we tend to ask employees how engaged they are, but what if we ask them how clear they are on your priorities? Imagine asking your team, do they understand how their work connects to the company strategy? Do they think you're moving quickly when priorities shift? And are their leaders modeling behaviors that they ask of others? Or even offering something open-ended. Where are you out of sync? The goal isn't a survey ever for survey's sake. It's to surface tension before it turns into turnover or disengagement. And same goes for customers. A lot of feedback loops that I've seen inside companies, they'll stop at NPS or CSAT scores, but those only tell you how they felt. It doesn't really tell you why. So I would say try adding a post-implementation retrospective, 30 to 60 days in with a new customer, and ask them, what was harder than you expected when you went through our onboarding? Where did our process surprise or frustrate you? These questions aren't going to just help your customer experience team or your account managers. They also give your strategy real-time insight into where the customer experience and your company priorities might be out of sync. And just a heads up, the next session that I have in July is going to dig into this exact topic. We'll go much deeper in how to build smart listening loops from both employees and customers and how to actually use what you hear. But for now, the takeaway is if you're not building in feedback, your strategy will be flying blind. So the faster your environment changes, and we all know how fast things are moving right now, the more important it becomes to listen with intention. And here's something I've seen again and again, and maybe you have too, so I thought it was worth mentioning. But a lot of times I think an executive team will roll out a strong strategy. There'll be a town hall meeting, maybe they have a really strong PowerPoint and they send out a few emails. But then 30 days later, it's sort of forgotten, and people on the front lines are making decisions and they're guessing. They're guessing what matters. They're kind of guessing what they should be prioritizing. They're guessing what leadership would want. And that is not necessarily a strategy problem, but it's a clarity and a communication problem. A good strategy has to cascade, not as like a waterfall of tasks, but as a through line that's logical. So how does the North Star contribute to the strategic pillars, annual objectives? And then how does that translate to the team's goals? And how does that translate to my daily actions? Because if your customer service rep or your warehouse lead can't connect their actions to the strategy, that's a failure point. Strategy is only going to move when it's owned and understood across every layer. And you can probably tell that I've had a lot of internal comms experience because I feel really passionate that there are plenty of ways to do this. It's not just about alignment, it's about decision making. And when people are making trade-offs in the moment, they also need a shared filter. Not what do I think is best, but what strategic priority does this serve? When everyone's making decisions from the same reference point, when you train them to make it from the same reference point, you'll get way more consistency. And without it, you'll get kind of this fragmented approach to a lot of different things. I stole this slide from one of the other presentations, but I felt like it was worth repeating because one misaligned message doesn't just stop at one team, it echoes through the whole organization. It's one of the most frustrating and most invisible ways that strategy can stall. It could be one single vague or inconsistent message at the top that will create all these distortions at every layer below. So if you want your strategy to move, it's not enough to communicate it once. You have to translate, you have to reinforce, and you have to check for this drift at every level. Which brings me to the obvious point that I've been saying, that strategy doesn't stick unless it is socialized. So I feel like strategies are usually done by the executive team, operations weighs in, but are your communications team members heavily involved in how this gets rolled out to the company? Because most people need to hear something at least 7 times before they internalize it, especially if it changes how they're going to work. So if you're rolling out a new strategic direction, expect to repeat it often, expect it to seem annoying in your head, and expect to repeat it in many different formats: visuals, stories, use cases, one-pagers, team meetings, recaps, rituals. The repetition, it will be annoying, but it is clarity in action. Also, I would warn you not to over-index on big announcements. Kickoffs are important, but they're not what makes the strategy stick. Strategy, again, lives in the small, informal, repeated conversations. It's your manager saying, this is why we're pausing that project. It doesn't ladder up anymore. Or it's a team lead tying their weekly goals back to a strategic objective. Or it's someone asking the question, how does that help us deliver on whatever the North Star is in a meeting? And then top-down communication is obviously only part of the puzzle. Strategy gets much more sticky when it moves sideways and when it comes from the bottom up. And that's when team members are reinforcing it to each other. When people at every level are using it to guide their work, not just react to direction from above. So if you want your strategy to move, you have to build in a communication plan that's human and not just hierarchical. So make it visible, make it repeatable, and make sure it reaches every level of the organization more than just one time. And then This is just, I want to say out loud, this pattern that a lot of people don't want to admit, but it's when strategy says one thing, but your culture, which we talked a lot about before, what actually gets reinforced says another thing. And you've probably seen versions of this. Your strategy says collaborate, but your incentives reward silos, not teamwork. Your strategy says move fast, but you have a million approval layers. When strategy says one thing, but people behave in a way that makes more sense for how they are actually rewarded, measured, or managed, because they will always be looking at what is being reinforced more than what's communicated. This is the strategy culture gap that you have to be mindful of. It's not intentional, but it is very corrosive because people will stop trusting the strategy when the culture just doesn't support it. So the question becomes, and we've also touched on a lot of these things before, what's really shaping behavior? Because it's not just what we say, it's these invisible mechanics underneath. Who makes decisions, who has the power, who speaks up, who gets celebrated, what gets celebrated, and what gets quietly penalized. And these unspoken norms about power, accountability, and who has a voice, they're not going to show up in the strategy deck, but they are going to be what determine whether your strategy gains traction or it dies. So always something to be looking for, sensing for. And then how do you know when that misalignment has started to take hold? I stole this directly from our alignment presentation because you're not going to hear someone say we're out of alignment, but you might hear some of these things. And I thought this was urgent, but apparently we've shifted. That's not what I heard. But we were already working on that. These all sound like minor frustrations, but they're really early warning signs. They're telling you that this strategy is not being translated consistently. Decision filters are not being used, and people are making up their own priorities because no clear ones have been reinforced. When you take them individually, these comments always seem small, but together they'll paint a picture of strategy drift. And if you've joined previous sessions, you'll recognize this framework, but it's as relevant here as ever. When strategy gets stuck, it's usually because of either friction points that slow things down, listening gaps that are filtering or blocking insight, a lack of operational integration, or strategies that just are not workable given your current system or your current culture or your current systems. Your strategy doesn't operate in a vacuum. It's going to flow or get blocked through your systems, behaviors, and structure. So if you are seeing red flags, this is a great place to start diagnosing that root cause. And typically there's no big moment when someone raises their hand and says like, hey, this strategy isn't working anymore. It usually looks like teams being busy, but they're not aligned. Their priorities are shifting, but no one's sure why. Priorities still quietly. People are no longer scheduling postmortems. The strategy will start feeling like wallpaper, like it's still there, but it's not driving anything. And when you're inside the system every day, I will say it can be really hard to see this clearly because internal conversations are going to tend to protect harmony, not clarity. And leaders will often see the same symptoms, but they'll interpret them very differently. And people, especially at lower levels, will filter what they say up the chain. We're still at will employment. So people are definitely afraid to speak up, and we are fools if we don't understand that and build in feedback mechanisms for that. So the signals are there, but they may get muffled. And that's why I always say you can't fix what you can't see. And this is my shameless plug for bringing in an outside perspective, but seriously, not for someone to come in with the answers, but to help surface the truth of what is already happening. Because when you're deep inside that day-to-day, it's really hard to spot the real root causes, especially when people are working hard and trying their best. And especially when people don't appreciate the inside perspective and they think that you are jaded or they think that you're not seeing clearly. For whatever reason, people will respond to the outside perspective better. I think, and if I can speak from what I think my superpower is, it's really helping organizations surface what is not being said, the misalignment that's there but has not been named, and the tension between teams that slows things down, and the cultural patterns that undermine even the best intentions or the best strategy. And these are two assessments I'm starting to utilize inside my practice. They're not diagnostic tools in the traditional sense. They're more like conversation starters. They're like holding up a mirror and revealing patterns. And they help me answer two key questions. How does your team actually experience the business? What kind of change is your organization truly ready for? And then the BII, the Business Identity Index, it helps teams map how different people perceive the business. So what is the purpose, priorities, and personality? And it surfaces misalignments between functions, leadership tiers, and even sometimes founders and new hires. In short, it tells tells us who you are strategically on paper and in practice. And it's especially useful when teams are creating their own mini strategies, or you're trying to unify departments with competing narrative, or your leadership alignment feels kind of fragile. And then the change capacity assessment I've been using looks at a different layer. So it looks at how much change can your culture currently support. And it helps us identify where capability is strong and where the organization might unintentionally be resisting progress. And so it's crucial when you've got great ideas, but slow execution, or you're sensing that change fatigue is quietly settling in, or sometimes past transformations have left scars that no one wants to talk about. And so together, I've been using these tools to give a multidimensional view, not just of where you want to go, but what might need to shift in order to get there. And I don't use them in isolation. I combine them with interviews and focus groups to create this like full organizational health assessment, something tailored exactly specifically to the company's growth goals, the culture, and your people. But this is also my PSA, that whether you're exploring this type of work inside your own company, these are the questions that I recommend sitting with. Not just, are you ready for change, but are you willing to see clearly first? Are you brave enough to surface what might be holding you back, even if it's uncomfortable? Even if you are going to flag some high performers as perhaps not values aligned, are you comfortable making decisions around that? And I know that everyone here is not in the C-suite, so you might not hold the title that makes the final call on strategy or culture. And it's easy to think, and I know I've thought it before, that this isn't mine to change. But to those of you in that seat, I want you to hear that you don't need positional power to create influence. In fact, some of the most meaningful change that I've seen started with someone in the middle, someone asking better questions, someone creating space for reflection, and someone simply modeling what alignment looks like. So you might not control the org chart, but you do control the culture that surrounds you. And if you yourself are modeling clarity, curiosity, and courage, that creates ripples. And I'll add, there are other more creative ways I've seen people lead change from the middle. One that I talk about all the time that stuck with me is my experience working with a shadow board, which is a cross-functional group of emerging leaders. They aren't in formal positions of power, but they tap into what's happening in the organization and surface insights that the executive team couldn't see. So if you're in that spot where you're ready to lead, but you're not sure how, please reach out to me. I would love to brainstorm with you, no strings attached. We're all in this for the greater good. And so if today was about surfacing the places where strategy can drift or stall, the next time we're shifting to what holds the whole thing together, which are the voices inside and outside your business. So on July 9th, we're going to focus on how to truly hear and act on voice of the employee and voice of customer, not just surveys and scorecards, but deep listening loops that surface insights you would otherwise miss. So if today gave you clarity, language, or even just a few questions worth sitting with, I hope you'll join us again on July 9th. So as we wrap up, I will remind you, I'm currently offering a pilot version of that organizational health assessment, combining those two assessments we talked about today, along with interviews, synthesis, and real-time insight into kind of one report. That's something you're curious about. I'll be sending more details in my follow-up. I'm also building a more intentional space for my writing and my thinking over on Substack. There's a free subscription you can sign up for. And those who want to go deeper, I'll be rolling out some kind of paid subscriber perk sometime soon. I'd be honored for you guys to join me there. And one more thing, I promised I'd show you how to use AI to make your strategy more actionable. So in the follow-up email, you'll get a worksheet that pulls together all the different elements we talked about today to make sure you've got a checklist of what goes in it. And then some built-in AI prompts that'll help you draft cascading goals, tighten your priorities, and strengthen those feedback loops. Phew. So finally, thank you. Thank you for showing up today, for making the time, for thinking about the hard and messy work of making strategy actually move, and keep an eye on your inbox. Well, thank you for the hearts and claps. It's so cute. And just know I really am on the other end of those emails. So if something stuck with you, hit reply, tell me what landed. I would love to hear it. And I'll go off and work on the next presentation about voice of employee and voice of customer. And I hope to see you guys there. Thank you so much.